Welcome back to the TLCU training sessions on LS2 Preferences. This is the second and final part of our journey through all of the settings available to you in Library.Solution LS2 Preferences module. Remember, I will be using 5.6.1, the latest version of the Library.Solution software for this training, but many of the settings I am explaining are available in early versions of the software as well, but may be located in slightly different categories. Moving on to the Security tab, we first have Roles. There are default roles configured for each of the modules that have different levels of permission, but you can always create new rules to suit your library. For example, the inventory feature is now embedded in LS2 cataloging with just 2 permissions. Now say you have volunteers that are running inventory. We obviously do not want to give them all of these other cataloging permissions. To create a new role, simply select the role most similar to the one you are about to create and use Copy to New Role. Name the new role and choose Add. For our particular example, it would be probably easiest to use Disable All Permissions since there are so many things we do not want this role to be able to use. Then we'll scroll down to find the inventory permissions and enable just that one to give them the ability to inventory. Once that permission is changed, the role automatically saves. Then, under Security comes the Users section, which allows you to designate access privileges for individuals who will use the software. When you add a new user, simply give them a username and password before selecting the login locations that they will have access to. Each user must at least have an LS2 staff role. Then choose whether the user should have normal clearance, meaning they have to put in an override password, or whether they will have override or supervisor clearance and do not need to enter the password. Enabling local borrower or local title search will make those searches default to information for the user's logged in location first. Red comment bubbles can also be enabled if you want them to stand out more in LS2 staff. Borrower timeout is the period of time a borrower's account can be idle before their information is cleared from the LS2 staff screen. If you find that you're often walking away from your desk with the patron's account up, you can shorten or lengthen this to help your workflows. For the other modules, simply select the role as necessary or no role. In LS2 cataloging, if a role is selected, you will also choose the default location that is used upon login, as well as being sure to use the holdings code for item statistics. The last area is for LS2 reports roles and will only be available if you have LS2 reports licenses left. The roles here are not customizable, but there are still different levels available. Reports user is your typical role and will give this user the ability to run, schedule, and manage their own reports folders. Reports configuration role has all of the abilities of the regular reports user, plus they can manage all users' schedule. And finally, there is the reports author role, if you have a license for the reports authoring capabilities. Moving to the Types and Code section, the first menu option is for academic reserves and setting up the course and/or department codes if you choose to use these in managing your academic reserves collection. Both use a similar menu to add a new code, simply needing a code and a description. These do not have to be configured to use academic reserves, but simply help you in assigning reserves more specifically. If you assign a department or course code, when your patron uses the Academic Reserve Search feature in LS2 Pack, they can also limit their search by either one of these. Then we move into holdings codes. And this is one of the first pieces in what I call the puzzle of creating the circulation rules for your library. The other 2 pieces we are going to talk about are borrower types and the rules profiles themselves. Creating and assigning all of these pieces is a very lengthy topic, and I encourage you to visit the LS Community Site training section for some more in-depth resources on configuring rules for your library. In a holdings code, we are setting up the collections within our library. We must choose the code, a location, a short description, and a long description. Take note, the long description is what shows an LS2 pack when your borrowers choose to filter by collection. This field has a max of 20 characters, so you may need to think about intuitive abbreviations to help your borrowers. Then we have several choices in how this holdings code may behave. Do we want items in it to circulate or not? Do we want to hide them from the public? Or even does this holdings code contain magnetic media? You can also choose whether this items will fill holds at its own location first, or even if it will be allowed to float between locations. Automatic renewals are also an option here at the holdings code level, and is the second of the three places, the middle of the road option where, if enabled, all materials in this holdings code could be considered for automatic renewal. Call number type can be selected, dependent on the materials in the collection. Then retain history setting will allow us to choose if we want how many of those three borrowers we want to see for past transactions. Finally, there are also your rental and replacement cost fees that you can set up at this level. The second piece in this circulation rules puzzle is your borrower types. This is where you configure the groups of people that are allowed to check out material at your library and define some of their limits. In the borrower type, you set up some basic information about that type, then can choose whether or not this borrower type automatically updates. Automatic updates can be based on specific parameters such as age, issuing date, or upon first check-in. As mentioned previously, one of the most commonly used is based on age and birth date to age juvenile borrowers up to adults. However, based on issuing date and upon first check-in are also milestones that you can use to update. Then we have block limits, where we set the maximum number of items before these trigger a block. They are for checkouts, overdues, and fine limits. Then we have a section for overrides. These mimic settings that we saw in the default area, but here you can set them differently for individual borrower types. For example, we talked about that example of due no later than date for our schools. Classes may end on June 1st for all students, and they usually would set their default due no later than date to maybe 2 weeks before class ends. You may have seniors who might leave the school even earlier than that, and they need to have a specific due no later than date that's even earlier. You can also set a few other general settings such as holds priority, which helps determine where this borrower will settle into the holds queue, the max number of holds they can place, and the max fine balance they can have before they will no longer accrue fines. There is also a recurring charge feature that can be set up to automatically place a recurring charge based on a number of days, often used to charge for non-resident type cards. Now that we've talked about both the holdings code and the borrower types, our next step is to make a rule that they will be connected to under Types and Codes, Rules Profiles. When creating a rule, it's a good idea to name it something that you can easily identify. Whether it's something like 1-day reserves, or something more specific like 2 items, 7 days. This is helpful in the assigning process. When setting up a rule, you will first pick the interval that it will be calculated in. Then we have a checkout limit that can be set, along with a cumulative checkout limit button. If cumulative checkout is selected, then the checkout limit will be added up among all the holdings codes assigned to this rule. For example, if I have a fiction holdings code and a non-fiction holdings code assigned to this rule, I could only check out 3 fiction, 2 non-fiction, or 4 fiction and 1 non-fiction, whatever totaled up to 5 cumulatively. If cumulative checkout limit is off, I could check out 5 from each holdings code up to whatever the other borrower type checkout limits may be. Renewal limits and periods can also be set, as well as here we will see the most strict level of automatic renewals. Overdue fine settings can be established here, as well as a setting which will allow you to limit the max fine someone can be charged for one book. 2 overrides available, one for due date and one for grace period. For override due date, this allows you to pick a specific date that books will be due and work slightly differently than the due no later than date we have been talking about previously. If I select October 31st, everything checked out under this rule will be due back on that date. Finally, the last setting is you can select where holds can be placed on this item, whether in LS2 staff, LS2 pack, both of them, or neither. Now that we have created these rules, how do we assign our holdings codes and borrower types to them? That is under Rules, Rules Link Manager. In the drop-down, you'll simply first select the rule profile name that you want to assign these combinations to. Once selected, you will see, if any, on the left, the combinations that are already assigned to this rule, and on the right, all of those that are not assigned. You'll also see here in the Not Assigned column the rule they are currently assigned to. From here, you can use filters to choose the rules that you want to assign to your selected profile. You can individually select them, or use the Assign All filter, then Assign Checked. Once confirmed, those combinations will move to the new assigned rule. Once selected, you can move on to the next rule that you want to assign new links to. Back up to Types and Codes, Holds Routing. This will give you the option to create specific hierarchical lists of locations that holds can be pulled from. By default, it is set to fill holds without regard to location, but you can set these lists up in a specific way, ranging from largest to smallest collections, or being very specific in setting them up, maybe in their proximity to the chosen location. You can also choose to leave locations in the non-supply column, meaning no holds will be fulfilled from there for the selected location. Special statuses allow you to set up specific descriptions for missing and lost statuses. If you are not familiar with how those are defined within library.solution, missing is something you expect to be returned to circulation, an item that maybe you went to the shelf to find, but at the time was not there. Lost is something usually you expect to not get back, typically something a patron does for you by checking a book out and it getting marked as lost. These are easy to create. Simply select the status that you want it to fall under, then apply a description. These can then be applied using the LS2 staff, special status check-in, scanning in your barcode, and then using the drop-down to select one of the special statuses that you created. You can then use lists and actions to curate a search using the status parameter and selecting by one of your created special statuses. Stats-only collections allow you to establish different types of codes for either uncatalogued items or to collect counts for questions, things you might typically tally down on a paper form in your library. When you put them into the software, they can easily be counted through a stats-only checkout in LS2 staff, and then have reports pulled on them in LS2 reports. To capture stats-only checkouts in LS2 staff, you first have to search for a borrower. Many libraries choose to use what is called a utility account named under the library name to apply these stats-only checkouts to. Once in the borrower's account, simply use the Stats Only button, Select the category to which you want to apply it to, and enter the quantity. See, there are several default system-created charges as noted by the far column, but you can easily create as many charge codes as needed to help track any sales or fees you have in the library, such as prints, flash drive sales, or faxes. Then we move into the borrower section, and the first is borrower fields, where you can create custom borrower fields that will allow you to track extra points of data that the default borrower information does not. Libraries track a range of things here, from schedules for students for our academic customers, or to field information about a patron's computer use or tax area. When you add a borrower field, you can choose whether to create a free text field or create a drop-down with hard-coded selections. If you want to also be able to track and create reports based on this data in LS2 reports, make sure to select the statistics option. Once your custom borrower fields are created, they are seen in LS2 staff, borrower info, extra info, and are listed here, whether it is a drop-down or a free text field. Custom borrower fields are also able to be configured in the online borrower registration form to patrons fill in at the time of the form's completion. Next is borrower notifications. The first area is available for basic email setup, but the most useful is under the email and SMS tabs, where you can customize the notice text for each. In email, you have a 256 character limit, and the SMS tab, you have a 160 character limit. A borrower purge is also available to allow you to clean up your borrowers based on the different parameters seen here. When ran, it will easily outline who can and cannot be purged, and once the purge is completed on the history page, you will get a file of both those purged and not to be able to further clean up your database. On to the last category in LS2 Preferences, and that is System Settings, which includes a variety of options. As previously mentioned, label stock configuration will allow you to select your specific label stock to use to print spine and barcode labels in LS2 cataloging. Once selected, you can also customize the specific data that shows to create the perfect spine label or barcode label for your library. LS2 launch page is a page you often see, but did you know it could be customized? The first area are links, of which shows your LS2 product access links, but you also, under additional links, have the ability to customize up to 5 different URLs that could be helpful to have at the fingertips of your staff. Under the LS2 launch page pack config mapping, this allows you to set which location will use which pack config in the LS2 launch page dropdown. Finally is the message area, and this can be a great way to display news, friendly message, and even extra HTML links to your staff to show in the top area of the launch page. It has a very large character limit, and even when fully used, does not stretch your page. Online borrower registration, also known as OBR, can now be enabled by you here in LS2 Preferences. Online borrower registration is now highly customizable. I will go over a few of the high points today, but there are complete videos on all of the options available on the LS community site in the training section. The General tab contains some basic format options for your OBR form. Then you can select under the Standard Fields tab which of the basic borrower information fields will show on the OBR form and whether or not they will be required by new patrons to enter information in. There is also enhanced duplicate checking, and you can choose which fields to match or do not match on. Keep in mind there are several fields which are locked to require based on different settings, and other fields that cannot be matched on, like alternate address. The Borrower Fields tab is where you will find the custom borrower fields that you have created and can show them on the OBR form for your new patrons to fill out. And finally, we have the Messages tab, which allows you to enter the general message, as well as the terms and conditions of signing up for a library card, in each of the 3 available languages in LS2 Pack. Once online borrower registration is enabled and configured here, we will see in a later session how to enable it to display in LS2 admin, so your patrons will have access to it in LS2 Pack. Moving on to other system settings. First, we have an additional fast add setting, which allows you to choose whether those fast ads generated through LS2 staff will go through the automatic title upgrade process. You can also choose some LS2 Pack settings, whether your borrowers will be allowed to cancel holds, or if you want to show lost and or missing items. If you use Browse Virtual Shelf in LS2 Pack, this shelf location searching for e-resources will allow you to either show them based on choosing a classification type or exclude them from the Browse Virtual Shelf search. And finally, if you want to use Accelerated Reader and or Lexile in the system, you can enable it here. Note that some settings must also be configured by TLC. We also have 2 additional purges, a loan and fine history purge, which will delete statistical records for either loan or fine history based on the criteria you select, and also the lost item charges purge, which will remove the history of lost item charges based on the date selected. Then we have import settings, which, based on your cataloging workflows, how do you want to import batch records into the system? There are also settings that allow you to create temporary on-order items, RDA formatting, and authority control. Search Profiles is also LS2 cataloging based, and where you can add any additional Z3950 sources or control your hierarchy of ITSMARC databases. And finally, the SMS gateway settings allow you to view the complete list of SMS email suffixes attached to the carriers that are listed in LS2 staff. You can also choose to make them active or inactive to not show ones, to only show carriers that are relevant to your area. Thank you for joining me for this TLCU 2020 session on LS2 Preferences. As you have seen today, there are many settings that you can choose to customize how library.solution works in your library. As always, if you ever have questions, don't be afraid to reach out to our TLC support team or see our LS community site for many documents, as well as training documents and videos on many portions of the software.